Welcome back to Next Gen Console Watch, our show following everything happening with the latest gaming hardware. My name's Ryan McCaffrey, and I'm filling in for Damon Hatfield this week. Joining me today are, from Podcast Beyond, our weekly PlayStation podcast, it's Max Scoville. Hey, Max.
Hey.
Good to see you. And from my show, Podcast Unlocked, IGN's weekly Xbox show, we have the wonderful Destin Legary.
Good to see you, Ryan. Bam, as I always say at the beginning of Unlocked.
Yeah, you got to get all your catchphrases in up front. This man gets paid by the catchphrase. He's got sponsors. You know, he's got all kinds.
No
of
one
people.
else has that catchphrase. I can't believe it.
I know, it's never been used before.
Yeah, never.
We are going to talk about some horror games today because it's October. Spooky season's officially here. And just in time, too, we are getting a remake of Silent Hill 2. We've got, the day this episode drops, the remake of Until Dawn dropping. The Silent Hill 2 in particular, I mean, that's something fans have been calling for years. And yeah, it's just, there's a long list of remakes and new and original horror games out there. And we found, you know, we were talking about this in our show meeting this week, that it used to be racing games were the gold standard for, you've got a new console. Well, the way to show that off to your friends is get the latest and greatest racing game. And not that racing games aren't still pretty, but it seems like spooky games, horror games, scary games have taken that crown from racing games. That's what you want to fire up to show off to your friends. Man, look what my PS5 can do. Look what the Series X can do. It's where you want to throw all those teraflops at to get the best, most visually eye-popping results. So, we've come up with a list of some awesome horror games that you can play on your Series X or PS5. And we just wanted to talk through these games. It's October. Maybe you want to pick up a few of them. Check them out. So, Max, I'll start with you. I don't know if you want to start with one of the headliners that I've already mentioned, or dig deep for one of the deeper cuts, but give me something that shows off that PS5.
Well, I wanted to take a second and just talk about why this is interesting. I feel like talking about sort of the psychology behind this, and you know, you talk about like racing games being a way to showcase, you know, it's realism, it's like graphics, it's speed, and I feel like we're kind of past that to the point where the way you show off a game really well is like less just straight realism and more suspension of disbelief. And there's with horror, that's especially important. And it's interesting because like you know, racing games still look great. Like Forza looks photorealistic, but at this point, making a car look photorealistic is like, that's kind of a non-issue. You know, we see that left and right. But in the case of horror games, they also are a great way of showcasing some of the other stuff we're seeing with the new technology. One thing that comes to mind that was one of the big selling points of the PS5 is 3D audio, which is like leveraged really well by horror games, because after all, you know, spooky haunted house sound effects, things creeping up behind you, the sound of footsteps, or just, you know, eerie noises in the distance, that's completely, you know, amplified by really good sound design. The other thing is HDR, which wasn't possible back in the day. And one of the first instances of HDR being like genuinely impressive to me was just on the cusp of this console generation, which has been utilized left and right since, with the RE2 remake, where there's a hallway in that police station where if you have HDR turned off, you can kind of see there's some zombies lurking around. But if you have HDR turned on, it looks like a dark hallway and you do not know what is in it. And that is like one of the first times I was like, oh, I see how this can affect things. And it's, you know, it can be used to make anything look cool. But in the case of horror, it's really like properly taking advantage of that. And the other thing is, you know, going back to suspension of disbelief, it's the amount of realism and detail that we're seeing in current games. Letting that linger, letting that breathe. You know, a race car zooms by. Like you're not, you know, you can stop and look at the spectators or check out the things happening on the side, but in the olden days it was just, you know, Gran Turismo was about making the cars go fast, but now it's like you're looking at doorknobs, you're looking at, you know, creepy objects up close, you're checking out what's in the sink in that creepy Resident Evil house, that kind of stuff. So yeah, but anyway, as for games we want to talk about, Silent Hill 2 is a really interesting one to bring up first and foremost, because the big thing about that game is the fog. That was simultaneously something it was you know, kind of showcasing. The original was, you know, like, ooh, look at all this cool, like, you know, volumetric fog, how spooky it is. But it was also, you know, much in the way the old N64 games used to do it, a way of obscuring things that the game wasn't loading yet. And it's, you know, it was simultaneously, you know, it kind of in the way that, you know, the movie Jaws is so effective because you don't see the shark. You know, they
Yeah.
a cool tech demo would be like, wow, look how many pyramid heads can be on screen at once. But it's entirely different when you're like, well, you don't know where anything is. You don't know what's lurking in there. And this is kind of an interesting, you know, like my point with the HDR Resident Evil hallway. Silent Hill was doing that, you know, way ahead of its time. So it's interesting to see it, you know, brought back now. And obviously this is a game people have very fond feelings for. And its selling point back then was definitely, like, it was a showcase of the PS2 for sure. But I think so much of it was just really good tone, really good direction, really good design, and just it's just, you know, creepy as hell. And you know, it's cool to see that showcased, like that scales with it. Throwing good technology at it, throwing, you know, modern sensibilities at it, it still works. It still looks great. And that's also demonstrated left and right by the Resident Evil remakes. So I think that's another way that the new technology is really cool. With remakes, you know, case in point, like, if you have a very, you know, vivid recollection of what one of these games is like, seeing a modern reinterpretation of it is a great, like, kind of before and after type thing.
I think you bring up a great point, Max, because at the time when Silent Hill 2 came out, they had to work within the limitations of the hardware, and that resulted in a better product. Sometimes limitations can force you creatively to make some decisions that, well, if you had all the horsepower in the world, you could go crazy, but it offers a better experience in this particular genre for a lot of players. You have to focus on only being able to show a little bit of the world at a time, and that causes the jump scares or the scary things to be even more compelling from a player's perspective. And we see that in games like Dead Space, the Dead Space remake.
Yes.
And how they really relied on sound and the technology of dismembering the characters in that game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. But if you look at the world design, often you're in smaller sandboxes of those worlds, and the remake does a fantastic job of showing, like, look how we're able to modernize this, have those original principles that we had for the original Dead Space game, but they've been brought to the year whenever that game came. Did it come out this year, 2024? And we're able to do so much more with the engine that we're working in. And I'm super happy that they were able to bring it back and retain a lot of the design principles that they had from the original, at the same time modernize it. So I do wonder if having more overhead has been a good thing. I think in a lot of cases it's been too much for players, and developers often rely on the engine to do a lot of the work, whereas you didn't really have that luxury back in the day. And I do think it resulted in some pretty cool experiences from a gamer's perspective.
Well, Max, we've got a meaty list here, and roughly half of them are remakes. Another one on this list, a former PlayStation exclusive, just out today as we release this, the Until Dawn remake. Can you talk about that one for a minute?
Yeah, totally. I don't think this needed a remake. I think this game looked great. I feel like, you know, if there's a PS4 exclusive that has a bunch of creepy rusty stuff and, you know, people getting ground up by circular saw blades, came out in 2015, that needs a remake, it's Bloodborne. But Until Dawn is cool too. You know, it's fine. What's funny about this, in kind of the uncanny valley of it all, is that this had really impressive character models, really, you know, very realistic people, very realistic actors. And since this game came out, I feel like a handful of the people in it have gotten way more recognizable. Like Rami Malek's in there, and it's just, I don't know, it's gonna be funny to revisit that. Like, I think you can go back and replay the original, but maybe it's that, you know, hindsight isn't 2020. It's, you know, the rose tinted goggles of nostalgia, where, like, I remember this looking completely photorealistic back when it first came out, but obviously seeing the side by side, not so much. Yeah, I don't know. This is cool. I'm happy that it's getting another
lease on life.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, because also there's supposedly a movie in the works, and you know, the thing that happened with was it Supermassive Games? They've made a handful of Until Dawns. There was there was a VR spinoff or two with the Until Dawn nomenclature, but they're more recently known for like the Dark Pictures anthology, which was under Bandai Namco. Similar approach, but you know, I don't know. I'm interested to see. I guess this is kind of a cool benchmark of the jump from PS4 to PS5, because this came out. I think it was a really good demonstration of what the PS4 could do, and now it's kind of like, okay, well, what does it look like when you throw the full power of the PS5 at it?
Yeah, I had to do capture of the original Until Dawn, and the one thing I do remember is that performance-wise, it did have some issues where it was pretty chuggy, obviously running at a lower frame rate, probably even lower than 30 frames per second. So seeing it get the remake, well, I do agree that Bloodborne is the only game that Sony refuses to remake for some reason. I was glad to see that it was getting modernized, and hopefully it addressed those performance issues. Also, remake Bloodborne.
Remake Bloodborne.
Again. Yeah.
That's the takeaway from this episode, and maybe every episode of this podcast. Now, Destin, turning back to a former Xbox exclusive that is now gloriously available on everything and gloriously remastered. It's not actually a remake. Capcom themselves calls this a remaster, but I've played it, you've played it. It's the most remakey remaster ever, and that it looks so much better than it originally did. And that, of course, is the Dead Rising Deluxe remaster. If you want to talk about how that holds up by modern standards versus its original 2006 release.
Yeah, the game still plays similar enough to the original, but modernized enough that it's not clunky. I do remember the first game being somewhat tricky to play. It's on Xbox Game Pass, so I went back and played it recently. But yeah, they redid all of the voice casting, and they made a lot of changes in terms of visuals, where the game looks absolutely great, incredibly fun and sort of silly horror game with some difficult boss fights, I remember, in the original version. But yeah, it works quite well. If you do like the original control scheme, you can default to that if you choose to. I do recommend trying the new control scheme, but I was very happy to see this come out. And a lot of people were just very interested from the get-go, doing their own side-by-sides of the original game versus the remaster, not a remake. This is, like you said, Ryan, probably the closest to a remake you can get without calling it a remake, because they did make a lot of changes in the game.
That Deluxe does a lot of heavy lifting. And I think it's also funny because Capcom kind of set a really dangerous precedent for what a remake is by knocking it out of the park so hard with the, RE2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
And I know I like the idea of a Deluxe remaster being sort of a half measure, but they did straight up remake the game in the RE engine. So
yep.
It is what it is. But the minor adjustments, like letting you, I don't know, walk and shoot a gun at the same time.
Yeah.
that makes a huge difference. And, we have seen games in the past make some little tiny tweak like that, but not account for it, and it breaks the game. Like thinking of Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes letting you shoot in first person. It just completely wasn't made to be played that way. So if you make a change like that, it might seem like a simple tweak, but it can also totally, screw up the sort of equilibrium of what that gameplay loop is like. And RE4 was a massively ambitious instance of that, where they were like, no, this is RE4. You can walk and shoot at the same time. And that's one of those games where it's going to be hard to go back to the original RE4. Though honestly, with how well they handled the remake, I don't see that really being necessary. It's so well done, and that's a game that got maybe not remastered, but high res ports quite a few times. And I think that was really, I think if you're going to point to one sort of horror game that really showcases just this console generation and really, takes full advantage of it, even if it is, I guess, on PS4 too, RE4 is a great instance of that. It's such a gorgeous game, and it's, a highlight of the series, and they really just had a great time with it, clearly.
Don't you
gave it a
dare,
10 out of 10.
Max, don't you dare besmirch the name of Metal Gear Solid, the Twin Snakes.
Hey man, I like the missile backflip as much as anyone else, but that Vulcan Raven fight was busted if you can do it first person.
Ryan, I got to throw to you for one of your favorites of this last year.
Yeah, it's for me one of my favorite games, period, of this entire generation so far, and it just happens to be what I would certainly consider it's a horror game, and that's Alan Wake 2. Max, I know, is with me on this, and Destin, you enjoy this game as well. I love the original, and boy, did Remedy, they took a big swing with this sequel. Not only was it super long awaited, but 2 protagonists and I would argue that it's a much darker story than even the first game, which was no like light comedy by any stretch. But it really takes a lot of narrative, I won't say risks, but it does things different narratively than a lot of games. You know, Remedy's been playing with live action, mixing in with their gameplay for a while, for a few different games now. And, you know, I think they've really honed it to the point where they mix in-game stuff with live action stuff in a way that not just looks great, but also the story ties in. Like it has a narrative reason to do it. And this game was, even the first expansion, the DLC was really good. The second DLC is about to come out later this month, I think, if I remember the date correctly. But boy, Alan Wake 2, it was my game of the year personally for last year. And I really can't say enough good things about it. You don't have to have played the first one, which is now, I mean, the first one's from 2010 or 2011. There was a remaster of that that's pretty good from a sort of tech and modern gameplay perspective, but you can jump right into the first game. Although it certainly will pay off a bit more for you if you have played the second one. So yeah, Alan Wake 2, boy, that is good stuff.
Remedy's no stranger to messing around with live action sequences, but this is the first time where I really think it feels totally organic. Like the visuals in this are so impressive that there's no, you know, that uncanny valley is like a slight divot in the road. Like it's just not there. And that shows an incredible, I guess, confidence in how good the game looks, that they're like, yeah, here's live action people left and right. Here are the actual actors who got face scanned to be in the game. And, you know, we have like Quantum Break last generation, which did a similar thing, I guess, less aggressively. But
it was more binary in that game.
Exactly.
It was gameplay, and then it was live action TV episodes.
Yeah, but it's wild. And I mean, you know, tying this back to Until Dawn in a weird way was kind of an FMV game, but with CG, you know, like it's that sort of choose your own adventure approach. It's, you know, it's a playable movie. But yeah, Alan Wake, great example there. And also, you know, as for it being a horror game, they came out the gate being like, yeah, this is a full on survival horror, whereas the first one was kind of a spooky adventure.
We've got a few more on the list here. We can burn through these, starting with one more Resident Evil game. So Max, I'll throw it back to you for the strong representation of the Resident Evil series on this current gen horror game list.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, Village, Resident Evil 8-age, I guess, if you want to 8-age. But yeah, no, this one, I think with RE4 being as good as it was, it's almost easy to forget how much fun this was. And it had so much of the same DNA, but man, what a good time this was. It has that perfect balance of again, horror, but also action, but also horror. And it kind of felt like, you know, obviously everybody remembers the Lady Dimitrescu, the big, the giant woman in the fancy party hat. But I love that there was sort of a, you know, cadre of like universal monsters that you were up against. And there was something very simultaneously, like, very realistic, very impressive, with plenty of, you know, genuine scares, but also it had that wonderful balance of silliness and action in there too, that worked really well for me. And and then as for it being, they'd let you just do it in VR too, I think. Is that right?
Oh yeah,
I played on my
7
iPhone.
And 8.
Yeah.
Yeah, 7 and 8 both. And that's like 7, 8. Village was just a first person game, and the question remains: is that what the mainline Resident Evils are going to be now? Particularly after the beloved remakes of 2, 3, and 4 that are obviously third person.
They patched in a third person mode too. So I guess the real question is, will we ever get like a first person RE4 patched, or did they? I guess they have a VR version of that, so kind of maybe split the difference there.
Yeah.
Destin,
there's a couple of older, current gen timed Xbox exclusives that eventually came elsewhere that I feel like, at least for me, I'd kind of forgotten about these, if I'm being honest, that they were pretty hyped early on in the generation. And and they came out and they were good. They were good. They're worth
Yeah.
checking out now if you didn't check them out at the time. And that's Scorn and The Medium.
Mm-hmm. Well, the one that I remember the most was Scorn because it had this H.R. Giger sort of visual representation to the entirety of the game. Now, was it super scary? Not particularly, but it did more with like sort of grossing
creepy.
you out. Yeah, it was creepy. You just had this constant creepy vibe to it. But I really, really enjoyed how they really went for the art style. And Xbox has been doing that a lot lately with their games, just showing off what they're able to do with game engines and do sort of like weird things like with Scorn. And I would say that Hellblade 2 sort of falls into the same category where Hellblade 2, not a ton of gameplay, but it is a really impressive showing in terms of technology, and the team behind that Ninja Theory actually utilized that basically as an advertisement for what they are able to do with their motion capture studio.
Arguably the best looking Xbox game ever made, right? Would you disagree with that?
In terms of visuals, it knocked it out of the frickin' park. It's just absolutely gorgeous from the get-go. And I do think it's a really, really good example of a game that is scary. I think they could have put a little bit more time into the actual gameplay of the game, but in terms of visuals, like no notes. Everybody points to this as like an absolutely phenomenal visual showcase for that team. And I do think it's a really good example of scary games that are utilized to show the power of game engines and consoles.
Unreal Engine 5 for Hellblade 2, and then The Medium, which I played a little bit of. I didn't end up playing through the whole thing, but the whole next gen trick with that, which it's definitely it's a creepy game. It's got some spooky stuff going on, and that's one where you'd play effectively 2 games at once. So it was using the SSD of the next gen consoles to effectively load 2 games at once, which made for an interesting gameplay mechanic. So again, if you missed The Medium the first time around, when it that game came out in 2021, I think. So it's a few years old already. Give it a look. Max, take us home with Still Wakes the Deep. That's the last one on our list that we'd made ahead of time.
Real quick, I want to shout out that The Medium was definitely made with a lot of Silent Hill love in place.
Yes.
And I remember I interviewed Troy Baker about it. He was basically fanboying out about Silent Hill, but also plugging the game that he voices the monster in that. But they got the composer, they got Akira Yamaoka to do it. And it was, I wonder which was like how long were the talks for Silent Hill 2 remake happening? Because this was Bluebird team who they've
same team.
They've worked their way up. Their games have gotten considerably more ambitious and impressive, and I'm hoping that Silent Hill 2 sticks the landing. I'm very early on in it, but I mean it's kind of cool to see how far they've come. Obviously they're kind of remaking a classic, which is maybe more of an undertaking, but I remember this was one of the first times that it was like, oh hey, we're looking at something you straight up cannot do on last gen hardware. One of the big things this gen has been Unreal 5, which is just regularly just stunning to look at. You'll see a game that's made by a very small team and you go, how did you do that? And admittedly the engine does a lot of heavy lifting. There's I guess enough assets and resources out there that you can rent some backdrops and stuff like that. But Still Wakes the Deep is the team behind Amnesia, and in this case it was just you're stuck on a Scottish oil rig in the late 70s, early 80s, and that sounds bad enough as is, but there's stuff on there with you. And I mean it's just again to the point about horror being very much about pacing, and it in a sense it's sort of that is there anything suspenseful about racing games? Maybe when you're neck.
Not.
I mean, if you're playing them.
Finish.
When you're neck and neck to the end, yeah, but that's a different kind of suspense. Whereas like so much of horror is about building anxiety and having that sort of slow burn. And if you're stuck in, if you're moving more slowly through your environments, those environments, you want them to look good. You don't want people sort of, you talk about finding the zipper on the monster costume in the movie and being like, oh, that's a rubber mask or whatever. The same, can apply to video games, where if you notice, well, that's a, kind of, that looks goofy, or that, those graphics don't hold up, you're less likely to be frightened by whatever that's happening. And this is a really great example of that. That's fully utilizing both the hardware and the engine they've got. And also it's obviously a studio that knows what they're doing.
Lots of games to check out lots of good spooky games to check out on your Xbox Series or PS5 console this October. And before we move on, though, we got to get a new poll topic on this subject for next week that you can go vote on at IGN.com right now. We talked about a number of remakes out of all the games that we just listed. A lot of horror game remakes. So, the new poll, which horror game would you want to see remade? I know what I'm voting for in this, but I don't want to influence the vote at all. So, our choices, the ones we came up with are Condemned, Criminal Origins, that's Condemned 1. Eternal Darkness, shout out to my GameCube friends. Resident Evil Code Veronica. Dino Crisis. PT. I know we're cheating a little bit on that one, but we're doing it.
It's not a remake if you didn't make it, you know? You got to finish the game.
Yeah. PT and Bloodborne. So
I know what I'm voting for.
I have a feeling I know how this poll's going to go, but those are your 6 choices to vote on. Which horror game would you most want to see remade? Go vote now at the IGN.com homepage, and we'll have the results for you on next week's episode. I'm Ryan McCaffrey filling in for Damon Hatfield. Thank you so much to both Max and Destin, as well as our behind-the-scenes team for making this episode possible. Join us next week for more Next Gen Console Watch, all the talk of the latest gaming hardware. And by the way, your cries have been heard. Next Gen Console Watch is now available as an audio podcast feed. So if you'd just like to listen to us every week, go search Next Gen Console Watch, maybe throw IGN in there for good measure on your favorite podcast service. You should find us, and you can click follow or subscribe, whatever your favorite podcast service calls it. So with that in mind, this has been another week, another spooky week. We even have the set decoration to go with it. Love it. This has been Next Gen Console Watch. We'll see you all back here next week.